Hello, greenhouse growers. I'm Todd Cavins, technical specialist with Ball Seed.
And I'm Nathan Jahnke, Cultural Research Manager at Ballseed.
Today, we want to share with you some information about propagation, and we're calling it success with cuttings. We're going to talk about the various stages of propagation up to the point of ship and give you some tips and tricks to make your crop the best ever. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about what we're going to do before the cuttings or URCs, unrooted cuttings, arrive. This is really when it's very critical to do a lot of pre-planning because once the cuttings get here, it may be a little too late. So let's take a look at some of those key things. You see here I have sanitation of the facility and prep before arrival. So sanitation is key, but so are a lot of the physical and maintenance aspects of your greenhouse. Take a look at this picture. This was an inflator fan for a double poly greenhouse. When I walked into this greenhouse, there was condensation everywhere, which of course leads to botrytis and other problems in propagation. We looked up, noticed the fan had become separated. So here's one of those key examples of where, hey, just a little preventative maintenance could have gone a long way to happy, healthy cuttings in liners in this case. Other things to look at, sanitation, as I mentioned, is critical. This particular grower is using a granular product to help control the algae, but I can't stress enough how important sanitation is. Anything your plants might come into contact with, benches, carts, even though they don't come in direct contact with the floors, it's still critical because that floor will harbor diseases. It also harbors a lot of insect pests. If you will sanitize your floors thoroughly, and we really like an acidified soap cleaning, then come back in with a quaternary ammonium before the season starts, you will eliminate a lot of fungus gnat and thrips pressure as well. And then there are products such as this granular used in between crops as you move crops in and out for a quick algae control, makes it safe and reduces your pest problems. Also take a look at some other mechanical things. This happened to be a drain pipe for a gutter on a gutter connected greenhouse. Notice the connection boot is damaged here. Probably got hit with a cart or something like that, which is not uncommon. However, when you looked at the ground just below this connection, it was soaking wet. And also right there were tons of shore flies and fungus gnats. So again, a little preventative maintenance and regular maintenance checks throughout the season as well. We mentioned sanitation of the floor, but let's talk about sanitation for you and your workers. Having stations to wash in between sections of the greenhouse or in between greenhouses is critical. We humans are some of the best vectors for disease and pests throughout our greenhouse operation. So take time to wash up in between facilities. And also at this particular facility, one of our production facilities in Central America, notice they're wearing lab coats, and there's some lab coats hanging there to the left of the sinks and wash stations. They change outerwear before entering a new greenhouse to help prevent that passage of pests and diseases. Hey, we wouldn't be a good prep for the greenhouse if we didn't talk about our water quality. Have we tested it recently? And let's also talk about those fertilizer injectors. Have they been tuned up? Are they injecting the right amount? That's critical before we get started because it's easier to prevent a problem than it is to try and fix it later. And with our industry moving more and more towards biological control agents, think about this and have you got what you need ordered in advance? The key to most of your biological disease and pest control is prevention. So you've got to have these things ordered well in advance, and we've got to be proactive and do that ahead of time. It's not like the days of old where we were able to see a pest, come back and spray it and it'd be done. This is all preventative. The other thing let's talk about your people. Are they ready to go? Have we got them motivated? Do they understand what the needs are? Do they understand the critical aspects? And we'll go through some of those critical aspects, but make sure they're ready. Also make sure they're well taken care of. Are their workstations appropriate? Do they have maybe fatigue mats or the right size of stool if they're sticking on a sticking line? Also think about them and their break times. They need good rest to be able to get out there and perform good work. So make sure they're well taken care of and got their breaks scheduled appropriately. Okay, our unrooted cuttings have arrived. Now let's start the manufacturing process. And I use that word intentionally. I want us to think about manufacturing processes. Think about efficiencies and things like that. Well, one of the first things we're going to do is when those cuttings arrive is we're going to get those boxes protected. Most of the time, those guys are coming in at a time of year when the weather's not good, the dead of winter in January, maybe, or maybe it's the peak of summer if we're talking about our fall crops. So get those boxes in, get them protected. What I like to do too is I like to get those a few out right away, and I like to take the temperature of the base of the URC, okay? Not just shooting the bag with an infrared thermometer like we see here, but actually measuring the stem temperature. Make sure that that's an appropriate temperature for the cuttings you've received, and make sure that they're in good health. Also, just take a look at them. We're looking for rot or pest or disease problems. It's pretty rare in today's environment. We've got really good farms out there supporting our industry, but we still need to check. And then I want to really encourage you to store them well and store them for as short as possible. As you can see here, the goal at the bottom is to shorten the time from the box to the bench. So let's take a look at a few of those storage characteristics I'm referring to. The first, of course, is temperature. We'll give you some temperature examples, but make sure that your cooler is the appropriate temperature. Maybe a little bit different than what you've seen before or talked about before is the hydration or the humidity in your chamber. Take a look at these two pictures I have here. You notice the picture on the left. Those are unrooted cuttings we've got upon arrival. We just put them in these little trays so we could take a look at them. So here they are. They're kind of deflated. You can see they're, all down in those little trays. In this particular chamber, we had a humidifier, just a standard humidifier from your home improvement store. After 24 hours, look how much more hydrated those cuttings became. They've actually kind of risen up. They've expanded. So what we find on average is about your cuttings or URCs are about 20% dehydrated when they arrive. So maintaining that cold chain, but getting hydration into that cold chain is critical for the success. Here I have a couple of different pictures of what I've seen growers do. One of our big, large rooting stations at the top right, you can see they actually can roll carts into their coolers, but they have a misting system connected to their environmental control system, and they monitor that and measure that with VPD, vapor pressure deficit. We'll talk about that and why that's beneficial in a moment. I've also had some growers just adapt. This is just a spraying system that came from an industrial supply. They were able to hook it up to either their environmental control system or a humidity monitor to get moisture into that cooler. Otherwise, a cooler is a very harsh, dry environment that's not ideal at all for our cuttings.
Yeah, when we think about cooling, air conditioning is actually removing moisture from the air, and that's why our cuttings get dehydrated. So we've done a number of research projects at our facility in West Chicago with a number of interns as well. And so how do we know that we can rehydrate our cuttings well, and what is really the best method? Because some of you may be thinking that my cuttings are in a bag and I can just leave them in there and they'll hydrate just as well. So these 8 pictures here really show what happens when you use different storage techniques for your cuttings while you're trying to rehydrate them. We've got a humid chamber, which are the 4 pictures on the left, and a cooler without the humid chamber on the right. And what we're looking for is a cutting that's basically going to be parallel to the ground. We want it flying like a normal bird. We don't want that bird to hit a window and fall down to the ground. So anything that's flying straight or parallel to the ground is what we want. And when you look at these pictures, we see that humidity is going to be the best way to achieve that, but then also the better way with a humid chamber is no bag at all, actually. That bag reduces air movement, reduces humidity from getting in there. So the best method you can do is to make sure you've got a humid chamber for your cuttings. And obviously we can make this drastic difference in 24 hours. So a very short amount of time to improve the efficiency of sticking those cuttings. And we'll see in the future the improvement of rooting those cuttings. So as I said, we improve the uniformity of our cuttings by hydrating them. And with this picture, we can see the humid stored cuttings are on top and the ones without humidity are on the bottom. And everywhere we see a little circle, those are cuttings that didn't root well, and that variability that we see here is going to transfer down the line to our liners, to our finished. They're going to get blown out. So these are the shrink and the losses that we're seeing, and we really want to reduce that as much as possible in getting a uniform crop with every single cutting as much as possible. So we talked about storage a little bit too. So what do you want to store at? We've got a variety of different species or genera that we're working with in the greenhouse right now, and they can have different sensitivities to temperature. If you think about where a plant is native to, whether that be the tropics or more in northern latitudes, that can really give you an indication of what you might want to store these cuttings at. For the most part, we want to avoid really cold temperatures, so things that are closer to 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. But things that can take some cold would be our major crops like petunia, verbena, and geraniums. A lot of perennials as well also like that really cold temperature. When we get up into the 50s or even 60, those are a lot of our chilling sensitive crops. And what I mean by chilling is that once these cuttings experience a temperature above 32 degrees, they could start senescing, getting this brown lesion or coloration in them. And that's going to be ripe for botrytis development. So things like basil that you see here in this picture, we really want to make sure we don't go any lower than 60 because there is going to be some variation in your cooler. And if you don't know the ranges or cold spots in your coolers, make sure you get some data loggers or thermostats in there so you know your cooler well and where to put different boxes within your cooler. How do you know which crop to store first? Well, we do have some ethylene sensitive and storage sensitive crops, those being geranium. So this is one that you're going to want to get right away. Make sure it's cool and hydrated, but stick as soon as possible. We want to avoid any leaf yellowing or leaf abscission, because again, that's going to allow for botrytis to come in and decimate that crop. Lantana is another one of those that can easily yellow. But then as you go down this list, you'll see things like high essential oil crops, things that we call HEOs. Those ones do not like to be stored for a long period of time either, and we really need to make sure they're hydrated. So make sure you keep this list accessible to your crew so they know which ones they need to stick first, especially if they're storing cuttings for any amount of time. So what happens when you don't store correctly or you haven't hydrated your cuttings correctly? Well, this is a stress. They're going to have a stress response. And so this leads to potential breakdown when we get it in the greenhouse. So things like improper temperatures. If we're too low and we induce chilling injury, we can get breakdown, disease development, and death and loss within our greenhouse. So any type of stress is going to allow for disease or even physiological disorders. So abnormal growth that could reduce the aesthetic of a plant and its salability is something we want to avoid. If any of you have grown Ipomoea or sweet potato vine, this is a crop that is really sensitive to stress. And if you have stressed cuttings, say for temperature, that's really going to allow opportunistic pathogens like bacteria or even viruses come out. And we're going to touch on that in a little bit more in the next slide. So we did a study with Ipomoea here in West Chicago, and one of the things we were seeing is just this random breakdown of these cuttings at different times of the year. And through this study, we determined that, yeah, there is a internal pathogen within sweet potato vine, and any stress that it comes from, along with a conducive environment. We have to have three things to have the disease triangle: the pathogen, the environment, and a host. So once we complete that triangle, these cuttings are susceptible to disease development, and a soft rot pathogen like Pectobacterium loves that when cutting is a little bit stressed. So we want to avoid those stressful situations as much as possible. So we avoid things like Agrobacterium and Rhodococcus and viruses. Stressed material is going to exhibit symptoms of viruses, so keeping your plants happy and healthy is a good way to avoid disease development.
Okay, a few moments ago, I mentioned VPD. I want to discuss that just a little bit more. Okay, and what overall kind of where I want to lead you is let's try to move as an industry, as you as your operation, more towards sensor-based decision making. Using sensors is really a very accurate way to make sure we get the environment right for our plants. So for those of you who are misting currently propagation crops, you may be using a timer. And I want to encourage you to, again, to kind of move away from that. That's better than trying to do it on your own and trying to remember, that's for sure. But a timer doesn't measure things like temperature, solar radiation, and they definitely don't measure the moisture in the atmosphere. I mentioned VPD, and VPD is something that we really like at Ball. We've been researching it for years. We use it in our production greenhouses. So what is it? It's a measure of humidity in the air. It measures absolute humidity, though not relative humidity. Relative humidity is relative. It varies depending on the temperature. So let me let you guide you to this really big kind of table here, but let me try and simplify it just a little bit. You will see that we've got temperatures along the left side here, and then relative humidities across the top. All these various numbers we have in different colors here. These are VPDs, vapor pressure deficit. The actual measurement is in a unit called a millibar. Okay, but let's just take a look at this as an example. Let's take the 90% humidity here. So at 90% humidity, if the greenhouse temperature is 64 degrees, my vapor pressure deficit, and this is you can think of it as the difference between the moisture or humidity in the plant versus the moisture or humidity in the air around it, that value is a 2. Okay, so that means that it's pretty low. There's a low difference between the air and the plant. But if I take that same 90% relative humidity and the temperature in the greenhouse rises, if it rises up to 84, the vapor pressure deficit becomes a 4. So in that almost 15-degree jump there in temperature, we get a doubling of how dry the air is, because the larger the number, the drier the air. So that's why we really like vapor pressure deficit. It gives us an absolute rating or absolute indication of moisture in the air, not relative based on temperature. Because every time the sun comes out, a cloud comes over, the sun starts to set, all those things change your temperature, and it really can fluctuate what your true environment is and how those cuttings are feeling and responding to the environment. Here's just an example of kind of some generic vapor pressure deficit curves. The great thing about VPD is they're controlled by a computer, so you can age them, right? A timer we may have to go and adjust every few days, but the vapor pressure deficit curve we can set with a computer, and it's kind of a set it and forget it type of mentality, right? So if we look at this, remember I said so we have millibars, or that vapor pressure deficit on the left, and these are the days after sticking along the bottom axis. So day 0, we might be down around a quarter or half a bar. And so we just kind of generically started it at 1 day and probably about 2 bars here. But you can see the general trend. As the cutting gets older, we start to make the environment drier, okay? Because our environment, what we're trying to do with mist and propagation is we are trying to stop transpiration or water loss from the cutting, okay? So we're not trying to water the cutting. We're definitely not trying to water the soil. We're trying to create a humid barrier of moisture in the air to prevent water loss from the plant. So those first 2 days, we generally operated at a pretty wet setting, a very low VPD. And then as we get a little bit older, you can see we start to dry it out just a little bit. This is where callus formation comes in. And this is just generically for a handful of crops here. It's not crop specific. And then root initiation a few days later. You can see we gradually get drier. You can also see that we use several different curves. Geraniums are always kind of a special case. They like to be wet initially, but then they go dry really quickly once we get callus formation. We have some crops that are very dry that don't like to be wet at all. So we make them very dry very fast. And then we have some crops that maybe have big leaves and are slow. And so we keep those wetter just a little bit longer. The point is you have to fine tune it. And what we know, the plants respond best when we are dynamic with this moisture management or humidity management over time. Okay, I mentioned think about this as a manufacturing process. We can really learn a lot from a construction and assembly line. Labor has been one of our big challenges the past few years, whether we could get it, whether we could afford it, whatever it may be. So automation is one of your keys to help solve that. With automation, you also get consistency and uniformity. You get efficiency in your operations and moving products from here to there, getting it from the box to the bench, nice and in a nice and timely fashion. The other thing, just kind of like I mentioned with sensors, automation of your environmental conditions as well. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. We as humans, we just aren't quite as good as the digital sensors and things that are available today on managing our environment. Now, does this come, without challenges? No, there's always some challenges. For instance, look at this flat. This flat was filled with an Elipot. This is an Elipot flat. So it's got the soil that's vacuum sucked into a wrapping. And well, something happened. I don't know if there was a stick in the soil or if the knife got dull that cuts the wrapper, but we can see here that there are a few of these liners that are not the same height as the other. And this is where we still need that human eye. We still need that art and that quality control measure to make sure the machines are doing right. Okay, so those that are shorter, they're going to have a very different water holding content than those that are full size. So we can see there's several in there, and from time to time we just have to make some adjustments and change it. But regardless where you are in your process, how automated you are currently, think about all the different possibilities in your operation, such as tray filling, sticking the cuttings, monitoring your environment and temperatures and moistures and things like that. Also with dibbling. So if you take a look at this, this is a flat that was dibbled by an automatic dibbler. Automatic dibblers are wonderful. They're nice and uniform. You can set the height. It's just great. But from time to time, you still have to have the human check. You can see that this one here, there was not good soil to stem contact, which we need good soil to stem contact. We don't want big air pockets underneath there. That's what we need that to get rooting. This one actually bounced out as it was being transferred over to the bench. So make sure you dibble with the correct size, not just, and the correct depth as well, and make sure there's good soil to stem contact. Okay, so we're going to go through the various stages of propagation now because we've got the cuttings here, we're getting them stuck, but what do we need to think about? As we go through each of these propagation stages, we want to encourage you to develop your own checklist. And we've got an example here on the right side. So during each stage, many of these parameters need to be adjusted or should be adjusted. So take a look at these and make sure that you check them off in every stage of your production. If we back up a little bit and just think about some generalities, so we've mentioned box to the bench, reduce that time, make that rapid. From the bench to from the sticking line to the bench, we want to make that rapid as well. So we have the road runner here getting everything speedy. So let's think about making that efficient and speedy. But in general, if we start with an unrooted cutting, here are some of the environmental rules of thumb. We're going to start with a lower light intensity and work our way to a brighter light intensity once we get that rooted cutting. The humidity in the air, okay, is what we're talking about here. So that VPD management, we're going to have high humidity early in the crop. And as the crop starts to root and grow, we're going to decrease that humidity. Okay, and then temperatures, again, they're going to be nice and warm at the beginning. We've got to have that extra heat to get those cuttings rooted well, and then we're going to gradually decrease that and use that temperature to help tone the cutting, get it ready for shipping or transplant, whatever your need may be.
So now we're in the propagation house, and so this is really where the growing process starts. We've got the cuttings stuck, and we want to make sure we get rooting, and we want to make sure we have uniformity of rooting. So how do we do that? We start with stage 1, and we can't forget, as Todd mentioned, stage 0. All of that preparation and sanitation makes sure that stage 1 is going to be successful. So in stage 1, we're making sure that we're going from an unrooted cutting to a calloused cutting. So all we're doing is adding callousing, or that proliferation of cells at the bottom of the cutting. This could be anywhere from 3 to 8 days, depending on the crop you're working with, but we have a variety of goals here. As we talked about VPD, we want to make sure that we are keeping those cuttings hydrated. So think about those leaf sizes. Is it an easy wilting crop? Make sure that the atmosphere has the right moisture so that we're not transpiring. That is going to help us optimize this callus formation, which is important for root generation. We also need to think about the cutting and the amount of nutrients that are available to it at that point in time. Our stock plant farms are making sure that they have the right amount of nutrients so that those plants are successful, but we have a finite amount of resources in that cutting. So this is going to come up later that we have to make sure that we're providing nutrition to these cuttings. So you may be thinking, well, I know the stock plant farms are great and they're making sure that we have good quality cuttings, but some of my cuttings are coming in damaged. Are they still usable? Are they still going to perform? We did a quick trial on this with poinsettias, and those top 3 figures you can see One is a non-damaged poinsettia cutting at the bottom here. The middle one, I just took a pair of scissors and chopped them up. And then the last one, maybe the knives were getting dull and they left a little bit of that epidermis on the edge of the cutting. 14 days after stick, we're seeing good root development on the undamaged cutting. And we're also seeing root development on those damaged stems, but it is a little bit delayed. So something to keep in mind is if you do have damaged cuttings, they're not useless. They are still going to perform, but they may lag behind just a little bit. So keep an eye out for that and be aware of it, but don't worry too much. So what is the ideal environment for this stage 1? As we talked about, we need to make sure we're rehydrating and minimizing stress and forming callus. And as we go through some of these bullet points, make sure that you're mentally checking off those points on your checklist. So thinking about temperature, we want to think about the air, but also our substrate. Generally, we're going to be about 68 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and similar for our root zone temperature. If you do not have bottom heat, think about making that investment because it does help a lot with our root development. And something to think about as well is that when you're misting, if you are putting on too much water, which we don't want at this stage, you're going to be cooling down that root zone, which is going to slow your root development. As we also saw with the Roadrunner figure, we're at a low light intensity. So if you're not familiar with DLI, this is the daily light integral. So it's really a accumulation of all the light that the plant is getting over throughout the day. And this is on the lower side, about 4 to 6. When we go on further in stages, this is going to go up to around 10 or even a little bit higher. With our VPD, we want this to be a low value, which means high humidity. We also want minimal air movement because once you start getting air movement, you're going to decrease that humidity within the greenhouse. A few other things to keep in mind is making sure that our soil is saturated. Once those cuttings are stuck, they should have the right amount of moisture. After that, in stage 1, we don't want to be adding moisture to the substrate. Again, you can add fertility at this point. Cuttings only have a minimal amount of nutrition, so you might want to think about adding fertility into your mist procedures. But as we go forward, we're going to applying more nutrition, more fertility to these cuttings. Think about botrytis management. We need to have a pest management program in practice even before we start stage 1. But make sure that starts at arrival. Scouting your cuttings and making sure you have the program is important. Some of your species, like perennials, may need a rooting hormone. You can look at the powder, which is going to be a manual stick and dip, but I suggest you look at some of the soluble forms like KIBA, which is going to be dissolved in water and then sprayed over your cuttings. That's really going to improve your efficiency and make it much faster for your workers as well. We talked about VPD, but there are some misting groups, as we saw with those curves. We have a dry group, we have a wet group. Geraniums could have their own curve. If we wanted to get nitpicky, every single species could have its own curve, but it's not going to be the best thing for your operation. So really group those cuttings and those species in what they really need. Our easy wilters or things with large leaves, that's going to have a low VPD or high fog or mist. Fog is going to be something that's not going to wet your substrate as much, whereas mist with those large water droplets are going to fall on your cuttings and your substrate. Dry growers like geraniums, lavenders, or succulents, those are going to have a high VPD, which is a low fog or mist setting. And here's just a few examples of a high mist group: Angelonia, Celosia, Scaevola, and then our low mist groups, obviously we mentioned geranium and sedum. Those are going to be our dry growers.
Okay, stage 2. So Nathan got us up to the callus cutting. So now we're going to take it from the callus cutting to initiating roots and maybe even roots to the edge for our stage 2. Our goal here is to develop roots and develop them aggressively. That way we can remove the URCs or remove the liners from the mist. That misting situation just is inviting disease problems, and if we leave it under there too low, we'll actually delay plant development. So the goal, get them out from under the mist as soon as possible. Here's kind of a general misting strategy I wanted to share with you. In this table, you see across the top there, we've got morning, day, evening, and overnight. So when are you misting or when are you not misting? On the left, you'll see that here we have the days of propagation or the stage of propagation. In general, those first few days, we are rehydrating that URC, and so we will probably mist all day long and even throughout the night. However, as we start to leave that stage one and a few days later, we don't need quite as much mist. So maybe in the morning we're still misting, but not quite as much. During the day when the sun is out and lots of activity going, the plants are transpiring. Yes, we may want to have a pretty robust misting schedule, but again, in the evening we're starting to reduce it. And depending on where you are, how arid your environment is, you may or may not want to turn the mist off. But my suggestion is that within 4 to 5 days, you should not be misting in the evening time. But again, that'll vary for each operation. Then you can see as the plant gets older and older and older, we're gradually just misting, reducing the mist as needed or reduced, what have you. And then as again, a little older again, maybe we're only misting during the day if needed. Again, the goal is to get roots on fast and get them out of the misting chamber or out of the misting benches. So this looks very similar to the slide Nathan just went through with you, but let me highlight some of the differences here that we're discussing in stage two. Again, we want to minimize stress and we want to grow roots. That's the goal here. You can see our air temperatures are starting to drop just a little bit, okay? But our soil temperatures are still nice and warm. That's where we need that extra warmth to really generate growth down there on that base, on that rooting plate. The light intensity, we've started to increase it. We were at 4 to 6, now we're at 6 to 8. Our humidity, we've still got pretty good humidity here, but our mist program is decreasing, okay, or VPD is increasing here. Again, minimal air movement. The plants don't have enough robust root system on them yet to really handle a lot of air transfer. Yeah, we may want a little bit to keep the greenhouse from getting too stagnant, but we're not looking for leaf movement here. Okay, and then once we see or once we know that those roots are starting to develop, and this takes sacrificing a few liners from time to time to get to know it, we've got to really start decreasing that moisture at the presence of roots. So also, we've got roots, you must have fertility in the system. Nathan mentioned maybe even having some fertility in the mist. I'm a big fan of that. There's a few crops that don't like it, but most crops respond very well to it. Botrytis management. Botrytis is our biggest problem in the propagation house. So yes, you still need to manage that. I would suggest switching chemistries. You'll see earlier we recommended a contact fungicide that actually holds up under mist. Now maybe switch around and look at something like a more systemic type fungicide that prevents not only against botrytis but other diseases as well. And yes, the pest management never stops, so continue to do that. And don't forget our checklist over here on the right. Have we thought about all these different changes and what needs to occur in the crop in stage two?
So we keep talking about nutrition. And one thing I think is really simple is cuttings are like babies, right? We need to feed them. They have a finite amount of resources. Being a new dad myself, I'm fully aware of this, but we need to think about that with our cuttings too. And so we talked about misting with fertilizer, but also once we have those roots at stage two, we can take them up through the substrate as well. So our part per millions that we're shooting for is 75 to 150 parts per million, but we do want to watch out for the ammonium and nitrate ratio. Ammonium is going to be taken up much more quickly, and that's going to cause stretch. And we do not want that with our liners. We want to make sure we're hitting the spec and the spec that fits within the box that we're shipping. So petunias may be a good indicator for you if you are getting a little bit low on nutrition. Those things, if you're low on phosphorus, they're going to purple up really quickly. And sometimes it's good to have that indicator crop to make sure you're on target. If you haven't, especially been making sure that your injectors are doing what they're supposed to and that you've mixed up the right amount of feed as well. So what are some of those nutrition deficiencies that you can run into in these early stages, and how do they affect your growth? As I said, petunia is a good indicator crop. And so this study that we looked at used a variety of different petunias. And some things are going to show different deficiencies than others. Up here on the top left, this petunia variety, uh, all of these were watered with no fertilizer whatsoever, which I don't recommend. But this variety was basically asymptomatic, meaning it didn't show any nutritional deficiencies, but it was decreased in growth. So this is all green and looks good, but it's not what we should have been able to obtain. This variety to the right did present some yellowing, which can be caused by nitrogen, but also watch out for your sulfur levels and especially that iron to manganese ratio. If you have the chance and are running into nutritional deficiencies, try and submit a sample to the lab and make sure you know what you're missing. This ratio of iron and manganese should be about 1. On the bottom, purpling is a very common thing. Also, many of us are moving to LEDs as well. And when you think about light, the more you give, generally the more growth you're going to get. And so those plants are hungry and growing. And if you aren't supplying the right nutrition, they're going to present these deficiencies. Purpling is most commonly associated with phosphorus, but there can be other things as well. But knowing that phosphorus may show up in various ways, these two petunia varieties, one showed it more as an overall leaf yellowing, and the other was more interveinal, but both phosphorus deficiency. So while these are important and good to look at what are the differences in color, overall these were slow to root, poor branching, and vigor. So we do not want these to be coming out of our greenhouse. Here's a picture of a variety of those liners on top with no fertilizer. We can see this purpling with the phosphorus deficiency, and we're seeing the yellowing here as well. And then here's those same varieties when they had a fertilizer program with them. You can see the growth is almost double in both of those varieties. So this is what we're looking for. Make sure that your fertilizer program is on point and get it tested if you're not.
All right, excellent information. Let's move to the next stage now, stage 3. We've gone from just root initials or roots just to the edge of the liner cell, all the way to a very robust root system where we want to enhance branching and we want to tone the growth here. So what are those factors that we need to think about? What is our checklist? Okay, air temperatures are decreasing, are about the same or maybe decreasing just a little bit. And this is also the stage where, since we have a robust root system, we can lower the substrate or soil temperature as well. Our light intensity continues to increase and our humidity continues to decrease. Air movement. This is where we can start to think, yes, I need more air movement. I've got roots now. I want to keep the air stirred up so I don't get stratification of temperatures and or moisture in the atmosphere. So this is where we can start to increase that. Do you look for foliage movement? Maybe or maybe not. Direct air movement right on the foliage still may be a little bit aggressive at this stage. Okay, this is a key here. We're going to talk about it, show you some graphics on the next slide. But irrigation management, we're going to irrigate up to a 4 and dry down to a 2. That wet-dry cycle is critical and will drive your root growth. Fertility, we need it a lot here, but as Nathan mentioned, you've got to mind the nitrate to ammonium ratio. If we give too much ammonium, we get too much growth. So a 20-10-20 fertilizer, maybe not the best choice here. Maybe want to go to something like a 13-2-13 that has a higher nitrate content. And of course, disease management and pest management are still occurring here. But this is also where a lot of folks really like to start their PGR program. And we'll talk about a few resources of PGRs and what our goal is with that. Optimum irrigation cycles. How do we build that root growth? I mentioned the wet-dry cycle. So at Ball, we discussed a lot the soil moisture levels, and they range from basically 0 or a 1 to 5. The 5 is saturated. This is where the soil is shiny, and it's really too wet for most of plant growth. Our goal is to irrigate to a 4. That's where the soil is uniformly wet. Maybe we get a drip or two just out of the bottom of the container, but we definitely haven't saturated it. We're then going to dry the soil down to that value of a 2. What is a 2? It's light brown, okay? It maybe feels or looks dry to the top, okay? It's fairly uniform dried throughout it, but it's not dry down so much that the soil is pulling away from the edge of the container. We're not wilting the plant. So that's our goal. And if you want to get more sophisticated and more precise, we have a lot of plug growers and rooting stations that are using water by weight, where they actually weigh the flats to hit these targets of 4 and 2 uniformly each time. And when we've monitored those and done studies with those growers, the root growth response is tremendous. So the wet dry cycle of irrigate up to a 4 and dry down to a 2 is key to success in liner root development. If we move on to this slide, which you've seen similar to before, okay, our temperatures are decreasing a little bit. They can tolerate a little bit cooler stage here in stage 4. That helps to tone the growth, not quite as lush, not quite as soft. So the liners will then stand up better to transport and or transplanting. You can see that our daily light interval is up to a 10 plus now. Okay, so we need full sunlight and or definitely the addition of supplemental lighting. Our humidity continues to decrease just a little bit. We've got really good air movement now because we have complete plants and we can treat them as they need to be treated. And again, this wet, dry irrigation cycle we started really in stage 3 continues to be key in stage 4. And we're continuing to limit our ammonium unless we need that extra boost of growth for some reason. And of course, we've got the disease management and pest management. Okay, PGRs, I mentioned in stage 3, that's where folks start to apply these often. But what's the goal of your plant growth regulator program? For the most part, in a plug and liner situation, and liners which we're talking about today, it's again to tone the growth, to prevent stretching, to prevent too much overlapping in the flat where it might cause disease problems. Our goal is not to stop growth. We're getting to the stage, especially here in stage 4, where we're about to transplant it. And when we go from a liner stage to a large container, we want rapid growth, because if we transplant into a large container, it could sit there for quite a while in a big, cold, wet ball of soil. And so we don't want to have applied too much PGR that might limit the growth as we transplant it. So think about your PGR and what the goal is here. And then what are some of the resources that I particularly use? Grower Talks magazines, you can go to growertalks.com/special editions, and they have both the annual and the perennial PGR guides that are put together. This one's put together by Brian Whipker at NC State University, and this one Joyce Latimer from Virginia Tech. Excellent, most comprehensive resources out there. You can also go to the breeders' web pages. So here I went to the Syngenta website and pulled off their information for Petunia deco. They have right down here plant growth regulator in the liner stage, so you can get some good tips and tricks there. Okay, but let's not forget, what is our goal? And think about pinching versus PGR. To me, pinching is not a height control measure, but it's a way to promote lateral branching, where PGR is just an overall toning of the plant. So think about those, how they work in harmony. Maybe you don't want to apply a PGR till after a pinch if it's a crop that you're going to pinch that you want extra branching on. So keep that in mind, that those things work together.
We can also use a variety of other things for height control, like nutrition. Limiting phosphorus has been studied fairly well. Josh Henry, when he was a graduate student at NC State, looked at using phosphorus to control the height of various crops, as well as in pigment development. So Alternanthera, different perennials, sedums, and succulents can be improved coloring with phosphorus. We also need to, again, think about that ammonium and nitrate levels within our fertilizer. High light is also a very important factor. Obviously, if you think about some plant growing in a shade, it's going to stretch. The internode length is going to be really long. So when we provide the right DLI, we're making sure that those plants are toned and the correct spec to go in the boxes that we're shipping them in. Thinking back on that Roadrunner picture again, we lower temps, and that's going to help tone our growth and keep those plants short and compact before shipping. Looking at this mum picture, you'll see also a variety of different heights, and each line is a different variety. So knowing your variety and how vigorous it is, looking back on those culture guides, is really going to help you determine whether you need height control PGRs on specific varieties. So know what you're growing and use the resources that are available to you to make sure you're making the right decisions for height control. LEDs are a hot topic right now, and you may be thinking, yep, this is more efficient, but it's really expensive. So how do I use these lights to get more bang for my buck, a better ROI? Well, when we look at the spectrum research on LEDs, we know that the more blue light you have in your LEDs, the better you can reduce your height of your plants, but also improve your branching. So we did a couple of studies here at Ball looking at these added value um, tasks and things we can implement with LED. And so this study looked at a variety of different uh, classes within the greenhouse sector using a 16-hour photo period. We've got signified top lights at 150 to 200 micromoles, and we're using two of the most common spectrums that are sold from Signify. The low blue, so this has a small percentage of blue light in it, and the medium blue, so we're increasing the intensity of blue light within this lighting. We had supplemental lighting, so we're comparing using lights versus no lights right here, and we're also comparing LEDs to HID, which many of you may be using in your greenhouse right now. And then we're also comparing the low blue and medium blue spectrums of these LEDs. Looking to the right here, I've got two different varieties of Calibrachoa. And as I mentioned, knowing your variety is really important. We've got different vigors, often different series within, say, Calibrachoa have specific vigors. One is going to be really vigorous, and one's going to be more slower and compact. So what is the impact of your lighting on those specific varieties? Well, generally, when we don't add supplemental lighting, our plants are leggy, the internodes are long, we're not getting and hitting that spec that we need to when it goes in the box. So all the way over to the right, we've got HID, a form of HPS, and those look great. But once we get over to our LEDs, which are in the middle, low blue and even to medium blue, you can see that we're getting a reduction in height and a little bit more branching. So we're stacking those internodes better, which is going to be a more compact, easier to transplant plug than something that's very leafy and long internodes. And on both the Congo, which is a lower vigor variety compared to our Cha-Cha, which is going to be much bigger, that medium blue worked for both of them, but low blue does it as well. When we look at Angelonia, though, we can see that Angel Mist, which is a lower vigor series compared to Archangel, that medium blue was almost detrimental to the growth of that plant. So when you're thinking about spectrums or considering switching to LEDs, the low blue spectrum pretty much worked for everything. And it may be just those really vigorous varieties that you're growing. If you have a section of medium blues, that may be the right crop to fit under those lights to hit that target spec that you're looking for when you're ready to ship your product.
Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed the day's presentation. I know we covered a lot, but hopefully you'll be able to go back and re-review things from time to time. A lot of the information we discussed today is available. You're watching this somehow, but where can you find other information? If you'll go to ballseed.com/tech support, you'll find videos such as this and a link to our YouTube channel with lots of other videos. You can subscribe to our various podcasts where we've various members of the Ball Seed Tech team, as well as individuals throughout the industry where we've interviewed them. And that's hosted by our friends at Grower Talks. You can find that as well. There's a couple of social media sites, such as our Facebook group called Greenhouse Tech Team. You can find the link there or follow us on LinkedIn. So, and of course, you can always reach us by phone at 1-800-879-BALL. And at the bottom there, you have my email as well as Nathan's. So thanks so much for joining us. Best of luck to you and good luck with your crops this year.